Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Grant and this is C&M Glass. Today we're talking with class 2030 in CPT Coding on E&M coding for evaluation and management services, and this is part 1 of 3. Now this week we should be focusing on chapter 23.1 through part of 23.4 and some of 23.6. However, I've given all 3 weeks for the reading of all of this chapter. Some key points we'll be focusing on are identifying the evaluation and management code, identifying location and types of service, as well as types of E&Ms, and a little bit into the history portion of your E&M selection. So let's get started. I've written out for you on the board some of the guidelines that you want to think of. So we'll start with identifying the evaluation and management code. There's 4 main types. You have an outpatient, which is any type of office visit or consult with a provider that is not admitted to a patient inpatient section, either in a hospital or in a nursing facility. You have your inpatient, which is a hospital or nursing facility, and one of your key things is the term admitted or admission. You have observation, which is typically done in the inpatient setting, but it's only over a couple of days or maybe throughout a few hours, or it's in the ER. And then you have preventative and other services. Each one of these has its own breakdown. Some of them won't have the breakdowns, others will. And so you want to determine what type of E&M you're looking at, if it's outpatient, inpatient, observation, or some other type of service. And then determine where is it located, and based off of that location, whether or not the further breakdown such as new and established, initial, subsequent, or discharge applies. Some location tips. Most of the time, you already know where they're at because you're coding for that visit. You will be given specific details that say this patient was admitted, or this patient is outpatient, or they're in the office. So those are some keywords there to identify if it's an office or a consult, it's an outpatient service. If it's admitted, it's going to be considered inpatient. And if they're admitted but they discharge within 2 days, it's going to be considered an observation. So here's one thing you want to write down right away. There is such thing called a 2-day or 2-midnight rule according to CMS. And this is where if a patient is inpatient, they've been admitted, but ends up either passing away or being discharged early, and they are not there past 2 midnights, then they are considered observation for that service. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of that one, but for now, let's look at the definitions of what makes a patient a new patient or an initial visit. So if you look in your CPT book, we're looking at sections 99201 through 99499. And this is going to be found typically in the very beginning. I have a different book than you guys do for this class, so mine has different pages. But you want to turn to the section for evaluation and management 99201 through 99499. You'll find guidelines in here that very specifically identify a lot of the terms that we're going to be using, as well as the definitions between new patients and established patients, and then how to identify the decision tree on if they're new, how to identify the actual levels of service, and all the details we'll be getting in later within this class in another week. For now, let's focus on a new patient. You should, in your CPT book, have a decision tree that looks kind of like this. This decision tree takes you through the process of saying a new patient is a patient who has not been seen within. You'll notice the C with the dash above it is shorthand in documentation for with. So a patient, PT, who is not seen within the office of the same specialty or by the same provider for 3 or more years. This is the guideline for how to determine a new patient. So, some scenarios. Let's say that your provider just came from another office and they brought their patients with them. In this case, you would need to determine, if you're the coder, is the patient being seen someone who has seen either our same specialty in our office or this same provider in the last 3 years. And the doctor does need to document that. So if my provider, Dr. Joe Smith, came in and brought Susie Valentine, and Susie had seen him previously, then I would consider her established even though she was new to our office because she had seen the same provider. Another rule is the same specialty within the same office. And this is a billing rule. If they're billing the same NPI number, that's the National Provider Identification Number, it's just a number that identifies who is the provider of service. And oftentimes when you're in an office that shares a space, they're going to send out one bill that says we're billing under a group and here's the provider who saw the patient. So if they're in the same specialty in that group, then you're going to consider it the same patient. Or same provider, sorry. Even though it technically is a different person, he or she is the same specialty within your office, and therefore that patient is still established to that provider within the same specialty in the same office if they've seen them within the last 3 years. This decision tree is here to help you, and you'll be doing some activities and exercises on how to determine if a patient is new or established. Our next thing is for the inpatient world, an initial versus subsequent and discharge. And one thing you want to be aware of is that an inpatient visit is always one visit for the day, and that's per specialty. So if I have a patient who is initial, that means it's the first day that they're in the hospital or the first time they're seen within my specialty. So an example, a patient's in the hospital for 2 weeks, okay? The regular hospitalist, after 2 weeks, bills a subsequent. However, let's say that the patient just developed a new cardiac condition and sees a cardiologist for the first time. Even though they've already been in the hospital for 2 weeks and would not be considered their first day in the hospital, it is the first day with the cardiologist. And so they would bill initial for the cardiologist. This only works for specialty. Okay, so for this example, an inpatient, their first day is always their initial visit, and it's one per day, so only one doctor gets to bill that. Now, you've probably been to the hospital at least once in your life, and you probably know that there's a lot of different doctors, and every day it's kind of somebody new, which is why it's important to remember that if it's the same specialty, it's considered the same provider. So if I see numerous hospitalists on the same patient visit within that 2 weeks, but they're all the same specialty, the second and beyond days are all going to be subsequent days. However, when I see a new specialty, it's not the same provider. So that cardiologist is going to bill an initial as the first day that they saw a cardiologist. On the same token, a discharge is the final day that they're in the hospital or in observation in this case as well. So if we discharge them from the hospital, there will not be any initial visits or subsequent visits on that same day, only that discharge service. In the observation, it's pretty much the same thing. You have the very first day, then you have the next day. And in the instance where they are discharged on the third day without a 2 midnight rule, you're going to have the discharge instead of the subsequent on the second day, sorry. So you may go from observation and then end up directly to discharge, or you may even have a same day observation and discharge, and there's a code for that one as well. The last section is preventative and other, and we'll focus on that later on in this class in another week. For now, go ahead and watch the second half of the video for today's lecture, and we'll talk about different types of history and how we select it.